and talk. Hello everyone, and welcome to my stream. My name is Prime, and today we find ourselves in the Retching Niche on Raven Rock in Skyrim. And you know what that means. If you couldn't tell by the title of the video, this is Storytime with Prime. And apparently my character is super hungry, and I hope they won't die once I finish off reading the stories that I've prepared. Yeah, so these are going to be short stories, Elder Scrolls fanfiction of a very archaically worded sort. They're in the vein of horror, and I'll say, without further ado, let's get right into it. There's no point in stalling anything, right? So, okay. The first one I'm going to read is called Lost in Radiance, Cast in Darkness, Trapped in Flesh. It's been posted on October the 8th, 2019. That's been... oh wow, that's a lot of years ago. Right, it's a short story that's made up of 3 shorter short stories called Acts. And let's see where we will end up. Right, so, Lost in Radiance, Cast in Darkness, Trapped in Flesh. Act 1. Lost in Radiance. She woke, engulfed by cruel light, surrounded by curious architecture, reflecting the oppressive incandescence in this place. Where was she? How did she end up here? Looking at the mirroring ground, she noticed her stark nakedness, covering herself in shame until it became apparent that, to her horror, no soul besides her seemed to be present in this glistening, crystalline wasteland. Wandering aimlessly, the bare feet steps hollowly resonating throughout the white void and empty air, she feverishly tried to recount her last memories up to this point, but it must have been yesterday, the female traveler thought to herself, when she went out to gather some herbs and plants in the woods of the shadowy grove. Or was it a week ago? Maybe 2? A month? She can't remember. What was her name? Who were her family? The more she tried to recall this information, the more it seemed to slip her squeamish mind in an act of mocking evasion. It was strange how the young woman felt. Queerly disembodied and ethereal, yet at the same time flimsy as if made from brittle glass, a weak existence never before conceived. She went forth, carefully treading the ice-cold, light-refracting path constructed from odd hexagonal shapes protruding out of a weird opalescent vapor beneath her feet. Stopping for just a moment, listening closely for any sign of life in this iridescent hell. Silence. Only her hurried breathing and hesitant steps, audible amidst bright nothingness. Utter panic crept up her spine. She began running, frantically looking for an egress, a door, an opening to leave this glassen plain of semi-translucent emptiness. In vain. Soon she discovered having been running in circles, and as blinding luminosity made it nearly impossible to discern any distinct features in the surrounding ghostly landscape, at last she noticed a shiny mound along the level prismatic path in the crystal walls that seemed to drag on for eternity, though through the entryway she espied a peculiar bridge shining in the colorless mist engulfing it. In quest to uncover whence it might lead, the hopelessly lost woman resolved to traverse the luminescent void looming aggravatingly ahead. It seemed as though time had stopped completely, and space bent and contorted the further she went on the overpass, each step accompanied by a disquieting crack, posing a welcome, albeit foreboding, change in the musical scarcity this alien plane presented. Moving forward with ever greater determination, the hanging transcendent path stretching across a bottomless pit of lucid fog almost indefinitely in its terrible shimmering blight. Finally, at its end, the young woman saw before her a towering, vitreous structure rising up from the frigid ground, reflecting not the light of the surrounding blankness, but giving off a familiar shine she knew well. At last, she thought, a portal to the outside world, away from this glowing nether world. Approaching the incredibly solid-appearing anomaly, the poor soul pressed herself unrelentingly against the otherworldly glass in the futile effort to pass through. Mind-shattering terror dispersed even the last vestiges of her fragile soul, as she discovered in absolute disbelief that, indeed, it was the outside world she fancied in this abhorrent mirror, perilous memories of the last seconds of her life rushing back in an instant when she gazed upon her gruesomely mangled corpse, realizing that she was irrevocably lost in radiance. Act 2. Cast in Darkness. Endless, pointless wanderings had fiercely imprinted the undying image of the grim and bleak scenery onto his mind. Over time he managed to fashion a crude shelter from the obsidian stone that dotted the landscape, likened to his former home as best he could. And albeit the man's existence shifted from corporeal to preternaturally ethereal so many winters ago, his partly translucent form sports curious, solid capabilities in this tenebrous place. For reasons unbeknownst to him, the Urbis, fiercely keeping this secret under lock and key, never to be revealed to mortal souls such as his, and, he thought, even the Aedra and Daedra must be puzzled at the premise of this strange quality presented in this dimension. Just at which point did he go wrong? Took a turn with terrible implications in the dark. It happened so very long ago. The rumors of this blasted creature of the abyss once fueled his determination as he set out to end its life. Little did the accursed, forgotten hero know what madness would meet him in those dank recesses of utmost terror. Alas, he failed, being used in a grueling play of comical bloodshed and inhumane puppets, laughing at him from every angle, making fun of his farcical attempt at justice. And so it was that this damned existence came to be, interminably caged, tied to this immortal plane of black-purple hue. He sat down for a moment, admiring the brooding vistas of emptiness looming at the glowing horizon, feeling the vibrating air filled with dark magic in a barren, dead atmosphere of solitude. Lost amidst the streams of unlife continually pouring in from the sealed cyclopean gate in its frightening antiquity, created in the earliest days of the Urbis to punish all mortals who dared defy Ilorin and his followers, both now faded into long-forgotten legendary and obliviousness, an untold myth of the darkest age no man or mirror was capable to remember. It has been so long since the day he failed tragically, the jetty black monoliths reminding him of his fate as well as the fate of others every second he tried to draw breath without lungs, and feel without heart, for he was, ever since that day, cast in darkness. Act 3. Trapped in Flesh. The two of them decided to stick together. There is safety in numbers, after all. In respect to what had previously transpired, they fared surprisingly well with what both had at their disposal. They still retained their magical abilities, if a bit weakened due to horribly broken bodies. He still hurled fireballs and lightning strikes, she still charmed her foes, but there is an element of despair in the tragic tale of how this terrible state of existence came to be, and, upon reflection, in regards to the earlier days of the curse, the odd duo used to be mad with fright and seemingly endless suffering, having not quite grasped their old lives, being erased and cast into oblivion, gone forever. For days they would wail horrendously, sparking rumors in the indigenous folk of the smaller farmsteads and settlements around Windhelm. Whispers of queer screams heard at night. No one dared to attempt at placing these odious noises, and in fear people retreated into their safe havens at dusk, in anguish of what might be lurking in the darkness beyond the borders of voids formed upon sunset. Though little did those rustics know that among the shadows there skulked in shame and agony two beings, not entirely unlike their own in nature, unknowing of what to do, where to seek help, but certain that, should anybody peek a glance at these perversions of nature, artificially brought upon by the Mandus to the Mandusberg cruel, cold, and unforgiving hand of fate, they'd surely get themselves killed, robbed of any hope for absolution or vengeance. They've been traveling far and wide, already accustomed to the numbing pain that rushed through their contorted, corporeal forms each second of their damnable life, barely able to see with rotten eyes, the sensations of smell, touch, and taste stolen by blinding fire. But even though their vision was clouded and hazy, obscuring the detail and colors of the beautiful world around them, in the end it was mercy, they told themselves each time they drank water from a lake or looked into the pristine sparkle of a freshly polished sword, for it obfuscated the ghastly, atrocious appearance of their hideously mangled bodies and warped faces, reminding them always of the night they got trapped in flesh. So, that was that. I gotta say, from all of those that I'm gonna read, it's one of my favorites. Yeah, I'm trying to find a place where people don't talk so much. Because, you know, it's intrusive, if nothing else. Open door. Let's open the door. Let's close the door, and maybe I can have some peace and quiet in here. So the first story is concluded, which is kind of nice. I cannot sleep in own beds, can I? How about... Oh, I know what to do. I'm here in the retching netch because I want the background music. But I'm also very annoyed by the people talking. No, I don't. I'm also very annoyed by the people talking, so what I'm gonna do is just put up the waiting screen while we look at Geldis. Nice. So now we've got the music without the talking of the NPCs. I thought genuinely that I could just stand there and people be quiet, but you know how the Elder Scrolls games are. Everybody has something to say and people just talk to you and fucking tell you their life story without you even having asked for it in the fucking first place. So, the first story has been concluded, and it's one of my favorites. So, we have a couple other stories here. These are quite short, so let's continue with one that I also liked, that isn't written from the first-person perspective, as I so desire most of the time. It is called Abada, which is actually an Islaidun term constructed of two separate words, and it means forbidden god, if I'm not misremembering. So, bear in mind, this is Elder Scrolls fanfiction with a lot of creative input and a lot of bent rules of the universe, so bear that in mind. It's actually quite long for a short story. No, it's not that long. Anyway, without further ado, let's read Abada. The seven of them met at dusk in their hideout. The empire of their civilization constructed many such places, of course, found all over the heartland, strewn about and in their purity reflecting the sun's rays by day and casting great shadows by night. But the Abaselli of the Ilocel has been created by the Order of the Seven alone over many years. None save them know about this place, not their kin, not their Apina, much less any Pelani from the other provinces. They alone held the key to this tenebrous secret, and a secret it shall remain, for even if the practices of the black arts are generally permitted and not really frowned upon, the seven strive for greater power than this, to cast down the shackles of mortality and ascend to godhood. Of course, there are other ways to attain such things as indefinite life, but the Order decided that a conglomerate of fetid undead would be wholly counterproductive, as they commanded the things from the realms of undeath, not be those creatures. There are rituals to achieve moldier mortality, none of them at all favorable, they ascertained. None but one, of which even they lacked the knowledge to conduct it, for it has been hidden from Mundus since the dawn of creation. Nevertheless, the seven concluded, it shall remain hidden no longer. Hence they've constructed a place devoted to an antediluvian malignity, being so ancient not even Magnus remembers, although he was the one to cast it out and seal the gate in times past, long before Lorcan deceived the Edada to give themselves to mortality. But the seven found out. All of them have met a long time ago, during the very creation of the empire that presently reigns, constantly at war with man for control over these lands. It was by pure coincidence they've worked together, all of them avidly conducting magical experiments in solitude, before they happened to resolve to attend the academy in Cyrodiil in pursuit of greater knowledge, each of them highly proficient in one school of magic. The first, a dangerous destructionist of immense power; the second, a skilled illusionist, deceptive and sly. The third discovered a talent for the art of restorative white magic, whereas the fourth revelled in chaos and bloodshed on the many battlefields the wars provided by conjuring various daedra from the plains of oblivion. The fifth, also a proficient herbalist, delved in the art of transmutation and alteration to morph and form the surrounding world as they saw fit. The last two, however, used other kinds of magic that were not known too widely and, as they should later discover, would yield great, if anomalous, results when combined. For the sixth did practice unholy blood magic. The seventh and final member of their coven would, with legendary skill, perform the dark art of necromancy. Such were the ways of the seven, and so it was they found one another, their paths crossing, swirling around each other, inadvertently intertwining until at last they studied the arcane arts together. All of them pursued unparalleled greatness, to rise above the elves of their kind. But these ambitions had to be concealed, for their kings feared usurpation, at any time ready to mobilize an army in the event of a coup. So it was the seven formed an order, its name lost to time and untold myth, studying in secret, away from prying eyes and inquisitive minds. To this end, they acknowledged in their near infinite wisdom and intelligence a place far away from possible spies was in order, and caves were quite unsatisfactory for their murky dampness and all the soot and dirt contained within these hollow hills and stony cavities. To this extent they resolved to dig deep in order to create their very own cell, only accessible if one was either a marine life form or a skilled magician to draw breath when submerged, for the entrance to their fane lay deep beneath the surface of the luminously reflecting liquid that was so abundant around the central island. Furthermore, they thought quixoticiously, this act does not miss a mocking quality of political defiance. Forbidden witches and wizards right under their masters' noses. By moonlight they would gather, forming dubious conventions with grim portent because, as they were quick to take note of, combining certain spells, rituals, and incantations together would result in untold horrors and awesome primordial forces down there in the dark. In time, scribbled notes pertaining to these discoveries were written, in great enough number to fill heaps of volumes with grievous knowledge, as it turned out that mixing the correct magical arts would open up doors to infinite possibilities. And although this has taken place in times long past, it is whispered these horrible scrolls and scriptures still exist, somewhere, obscured and cast in seemingly impenetrable shadow, unknown to man or mere. Some of these would eventually be found by just the right person, however, along with the deathly artifact. Soon the seven would stumble upon ancient legendary during their studies, myths of portentous caliginosity that were hitherto lost to time. This was when the Rapacelli were being devoted to the solid night and called the Ilorcel. And on this night the coven met in their accursed halls as the starry phenomenon that would later be called the necromancer's moon shone darkly, and a black mist loomed forebodingly on the horizon. The Order of the Seven gathered in their cyclopean central chamber, in the inner sanctum of the Ilorcel, in which they stood in bleak darkness, circumjacent to an altar fashioned from grey stone, dimly lit by luminescent welkin stones tinting it in a pale cyan radiance. The seventh held a book, ordering their associates to prepare for the ritual. Hereunto the seventh and the remaining six produced one black soul gem each from their opulent hooded robes of white and gold, in which they were clad, holding them before their respective chests, and made them hover, chanting the words, Lorcan, Rakuvarvoy an elnada, no barais deletanabievai abatarn of Ilorine. Hereat the gems radiated with light, creating anti-luminescence, a prehensile abyss of unlight, forming a crooked beam connecting the now quivering stones still afloat with the mages' hearts, staining their garbs, heretofore white with a coal-like substance that appeared to eat and claw itself into the fibers. In frigid darkness the evident leader of the group continued the invocation, uttering words that made the air vibrate with primordial might when spoken. Su belebala latia vasai, aadsun somalteliari sindne adsun. Moraga voi an angua an yabis, yedelevoige an yama vanagaya oyo. Tie amaraldane lalornir. Je astie moriele arakuvar elnare je joran sersen. Televoi an edevai an yama, larbe so gravia hafin. Upon these terrible words being spoken, the hall was flung into abyssal nothingness. Space and time seemed to bend, the very fabric of reality twisting and contorting in cruel, unspeakable fashion. A vitreous appearing up to that night obfuscated hell revealed itself, a dead, empty vista superimposed on current reality and the mundus. In the distance, horrid and grim, there emerged a shadowy entity, engulfed in smoky mists and anthracite fog, spilling from an unnameable circular void, ejected into space in strange color and queer incandescence. The ensuing voice tore the bounds asunder with thunderous calamity. A epidagon, a epinagaya, shanta kind, su kilor, kalvoi an kilor vain, so anyamabis sunabe, heka kind, nema lauta voi vaan kayald. The ground quaked, the walls caved in. Water flowed unrelentingly through the cracks, filling and flooding the space the seven were situated in. In that same instant, the black soul gems rose up into the air, gently approaching one another, merging together upon touch into a hideous artifact from beyond the veil. And by its power it was the souls of these men and women were ripped from their hosts' bodies by a preternatural might, crashing into the gem, thereby passing the open gate. In this realm, their life force dissipated, transformed into ghastly glowing crystalline entities, undying and eternal, destined to govern this otherworldly place of damnation and purgatory. Ever since, they've gathered souls by tricking mortals in infallible servitude to their deity, unknowing that they've been deceived themselves, at risk of fading into emptiness, should they fail. So, this was Abada. This was a lot of Eileidun language. And personally, I have no idea how to read that and pronounce it. Sometimes I pronounce the C's as K's, and sometimes I pronounce the C's as S's. And I have no idea, really. I think it's the correct thing to do is pronounce it as a K, if I'm not mistaken. I wrote a book about it. I should know. Yeah, right, so, if you couldn't tell, this is an imagined story of the creation of the ideal masters that inhabit the soul cairn. The ideal masters are crystalline formations that gather souls, I think, and they want more all the time. And, well, in this story it is imagined that the Eyelids, or at least 7 of them, made contact with the governing deity of that realm, and that deity transformed them into the crystal things that we know as the ideal masters today. So, in that sense, it wasn't even their choosing to be immobilized to such a capacity and also doomed to an eternal existence in that dark place. So, bad for them, I suppose. Right, so I have at least one more story, which is called the Aquila Exilius Report, and granted, it's a bit flawed on the surface, but the effort that it poses is commendable, to say the least. I think I like it, but there's been bits of it that weren't that good, but let's just read it. It's also quite long for a short story too, but I think this is going to be the last one for today. So let's read it, the Aquila Exilius Report. If I still have the time after that, I might shove in a 4th. I don't know yet. Let's see. So, the Aquila Exilius Report. I have already told you all that I know about the incident from last night, and I'm positive that no new revelations will surface upon retelling of the events that transpired. But if you must hear it again, I'll oblige if you insist. So, let me start from the very beginning. About a day prior, not sure when exactly, I have been gravely wounded by a bear. At least, that is what I am telling anyone who asks, for they wouldn't believe me otherwise, save for the indigenous folk of the Almarch. I'm a hunter by trade, you see, gathering furs, teeth, and meat to sell in the towns and cities of Skyrim. I was out with a hunting party that day. Rumors of a great 4-legged beast of rather prodigious size in the woods near Morthal spread around the area, so, in preparation, and to avoid great peril, which ensued regardless, I, for the first time, took to recruiting some townsfolk and a couple sellswords in the vicinity. I didn't want to hunt such a monstrosity, provided the tellings and whispers were true, all by myself. and even though I provided a more than sufficient amount of septims, going as far as to offer to provide food and drink for the journey without the requirement of compensation, it took quite a lot of convincing the stout men I met to follow me on this endeavor. In the end, however, we were a hunting party of 13 men, 10 of which were simple townsfolk armed with swords and bows, and 2 professional mercenaries with more sophisticated equipment, and myself, of course, carrying a regular hunting bow and a knife designed to cut off the fur of a dead animal's body. I mainly wanted to venture out and hunt of the beast of the woods, as the locals have called it then, for prestige and the kind of booty such a creature seemed to promise. According to the locals, that entity was so gigantic, one could fashion an entire set of leather armor from its hide, and sharp blades from its bones, claws, and teeth, and to me, or any man such as myself, this hunt appeared to be extraordinarily promising. To think of how many gold pieces I could earn by selling off its parts or products made from them would easily net me more than enough septims to even out my expenses for acquiring the men I had with me that day. Though as much labor as it took to enlist the bulk of our group, there was one rather peculiar fellow of singularly old appearance who, much to my surprise, required no compensation for his aid, but the thrill of the hunt itself. He introduced himself to me as one Axelius Venius, by trade a skilled and proficient herbalist and novice of restoration magic, who was inclined to help us for the sole purpose of mending the wounded who, according to his belief, would surely occur. To say that I was surprised by this benevolent offer would be an understatement, taking into account the kind of threat we were going to face. Furthermore, based on his appearance alone, I was awestruck he offered to help at all. You see, he was old, very old in fact. By his looks a very old and grizzled imperial, with white hair and beard, battered face, and dressed in presumably once white tatters. But what struck me as particularly queer about this man was his manner of speech, which caused him to emit an aura of antiquity that I could only hardly place anywhere. He spoke with a rather unheard-of accent as well, and at length it became clear that this manner of speech was reminiscent of very old Tamrielic, from maybe 2 centuries ago. By this logic, I thought, this Exilius character must be ancient. However, upon inquiring about his age, he assured me he was in his mid-60s, and that there was nothing to worry about, so he insisted to come along for the hunt, and albeit I had my doubts about him and his honesty in the matter, I was grateful for a free-of-charge comrade, a healer and potion brewer no less, though the sense of something iniquitous about him never truly went. By evening of that day, we met in the local tavern for a last stein of beer or a good bottle of mead, whatever struck our fancy, and proceeded to devise plans and strategies as to how we were going to approach our quest the following morning. After much deliberation and long discussions on what would be best, we finally settled on asking the locals as to where they have last spotted the creature to know where we should look for its tracks. We would then proceed to figure out our search pattern to look for clues as to where it might have gone and discern our strategy for closing in on the beast and who will cast the first shot. After we've established a plan, we all went to sleep, some in their own houses, since they were local townsmen. Me and the sellsword slept in the inn, though what was strange was that Exilius, the old man of almost antediluvian quality, also took a room in the inn. Back then I thought nothing of it, but in hindsight I should have paid attention, because Exilius, indigenous as seemed, introduced himself as a local herbalist, so he should have had a place to stay for the night, one might presume. However, ignoring this oddity more subconsciously than by deliberate thought, that evening he struck me as having an inexplicable weirdness about him that made me feel uneasy. I didn't realize it then, but believe me when I say that I realize now as to why I didn't get much sleep that night. Something was not right about this Exilius character, even if I couldn't quite place my suspicions. The next day, by dawn, all 13 of us gathered in the inn again to go over our plans and strategies one last time, after which I gave the rations I promised to each of the men. Exilius, however, declined, stating that he had been awake early, and already had a rich breakfast. I questioned his remark and persuaded him to, at the very least, carry a bottle of water and a venison chop with him, just in case. And after I insisted repeatedly, he finally complied, storing the items away in his pouch he carried around. After we've spread out the resources for the journey and went over our plans one last time, we finally set out to hunt the beast of the woods and put it down for good. We gathered and left the inn in Morthal quickly, heading northwest out of Eastmarch to the woods near Solitude. From brief correspondences with some of the local folk, we've been informed of the last known location of the beast, which happened to be in or near these woods. So we carefully set foot outside Morthal, and then left the hold with only a few minor incidents of some of the men tripping in the marsh and falling onto the moist, soft ground, but fortunately nobody was seriously harmed, and those who did receive smaller cuts and bruises were quickly and professionally mended by Axilius, who seemed to have a near endless amount of remedies on his person. After traversing the soft way-giving grounds, we reached the edge of the hold as we were stopped in our tracks by a sound of singularly terrible descent, entirely inhuman, if it was even at all to be placed. When the almost deafening horrible screech reached us, we were paralyzed for a moment in a mixture of disgust and fear. Just what kind of entity could conjure up such a scream? Albeit unsure, we quickly recovered from the initial shock, and mustered all our courage, proclaiming the ghastly noise to be of the beast, and decided to press on. We crossed the whole border, and Axilius located the scream to originate from a place somewhere to the northwest. By coincidence, we were heading in this direction in the first place, so this only proved that we were indeed correct in our assumptions. After about an hour of wandering off the beaten path and into the woods, we heard it again, the paralyzing noise of the creature. At this point we were sure that whatever it wasn't a bear of greater than normal size, as I first took to assume, albeit I still tell people I was attacked by one, for no one was going to believe me otherwise. We thought, then, that it must have been a creature summoned perhaps from the plains of oblivion by some crazed conjurator. Since we weren't as sure anymore as to what we might be up against, we decided to proceed by lurking and skulking through the woods. Now, for what's next, I only have a rather vague recollection of the events that transpired, but I'll give it my all to remember it in as great a detail as possible. We travelled ever so slowly in a crouching manner when the whole party abruptly came to a halt at the sight of it. "By the divines," one of us whispered with shaking breath, barely able to contain a loud gasp. We didn't glimpse much of it, though enough to discern that what walked before us on all fours was indeed no bear, far from it. Just behind the great oak trees, and partly blotted out by the sun, we were able to observe a being, evidently composed of flesh and blood, with no fur at all, and from the little we saw of its hind leg, ascertained that it was in fact, or must have been, gargantuan in size, comparable to a small house at the very least. Then came what I can only put into words as the most horrifying noise I hitherto experienced. First, I felt the growing tension amongst our men, once stout and motivated, but now fearful and dazed at the sheer size and utter nakedness of the thing. Then I heard a nervous creaking of thread just behind me, accompanied by a hasty breathing, followed by a whirring noise that zipped past my right ear and carried on towards whatever hell-spawn hid amidst the trees and branches and leaves. Shortly after, chaos ensued. Men, horrified and mad with stark terror, disbanded from the group at the raucous noise the creature made upon being struck by what I could identify as being an arrow that had just been fired by one of the mercenaries. A noise so indescribable as if the voices of the damned were audible through some open gateways to the void and the soul cairn. It seemed as if whatever this beast was screeched with multiple voices of various tones and intensities. The terrified men, 5 in total, turned back in fear and ran for their lives screaming, whereas the beast ahead of us quickly vanished behind the trees, up a hill northeast of its position. By this time only 8 of us remained in the group, sanity intact, including me, Axilius, the 2 mercenaries, and the remains of the indigents. Hesitatingly, we decided to press forward, now more than ever determined to wipe this monstrosity from existence. So we quickly advanced in an attempt to follow it, when I tripped and fell into a flat hole that was about my size. Looking at it, we were seemingly on the verge of possibly discovering a most disturbing truth we never intended to uncover, leaving us speechless. For said flat hole appeared to be the footprint of our game. There could be no mistake, taking its placement and overall frequency into account, but there was a disturbing quality to it. Something was off, without being obvious enough for it to be noticed immediately. And as I stood up, standing with my feet in the hole still, it became clear as to what it looked similar to. I stood on the outline of the alleged footprint, which revealed that its lining was strikingly familiar to those of my own feet, and upon taking a step back for closer inspection, we saw that the footprint looked like 2 pairs of human feet next to each other, one circular indentation above them, and above it again another 2 pairs of feet. I shudder still when thinking about it, even now. We gasped in puzzlement, visualizing as to how a foot had to be constructed in order to produce such a disturbing mark on the ground. After a brief rest, catching our breaths and drinking some water, we concluded to follow the marks of that unholy abomination, despite being 5 men short, but sure of success nonetheless. It turned out that following the creature wasn't too difficult, as it left deep imprints and bent trees and broken shrubbery in its wake. We followed the traces to a large cave entrance, seemingly undocumented on any maps. There we stopped. Our slightly arduous journey took us a while already, and Axilius remarked that if we wanted to enter the mound with the intent of murdering it, we'd have to act quickly, for dusk was fast approaching, and if we were to stall for much longer, we won't make it out by daylight. His remark earned the favor of the remainder of the party, even before I could propose setting up camp nearby to wait for the next day. So, leading the party, I resolved to enter the aperture with the men in tow without much hesitation, although I had a queer feeling when crossing the cavern's threshold. I felt it in my gut. Something wasn't right. We advanced deeper into the hollowed-out hill at a rather quick pace, when we noticed it was getting ever more dark the further we went, so in quest of some illumination I picked up a wooden stick that lay on the ground, which I almost tripped over, wrapped the small leftover piece of cloth around it, and before I could look for a source of fire, Axilius threw a tiny flame in my direction, igniting the stick, which now cast a strange radiance in the utter darkness of the damp caverns. Telling this now, in retrospect, I wish I hadn't decided to enter the cave in the first place, much less wander into the dark for so long before igniting a torch. Upon the makeshift construction of wood and fabric being struck, there at once appeared before my eyes the face of a man, stark, naked, and allegedly bound to a pole in darkness, for I could not see his arms amidst the black void the torch didn't cast light upon, so I suspected his hands being tied to the hypothetical stake behind his back. Amidst lengthening shadows, I observed that his eyes were closed, and he was breathing heavily. I stopped to listen more closely, holding my own breath, which filled me with a growing sense of terror as I noticed that not one person was breathing, but rather it appeared that a multitude of people were in and exhaling with great difficulty. As it were, we suspected it to be the beast's hub for fresh food and sustenance, which would have been terrifying enough in its own right, but it turned out to be worse still. I reached out to the man's face in an effort to wake him in order to supply reassurance, since we resolved to rescue him and his fellows, when just before I could touch his cheek, his eyes opened, his face squirming in agony. He started screaming and writhing. Then we heard the beast's ghastly screech as if it was right next to us. Paralyzed in horror, I failed to retract my arm in time, and the man opened his mouth and bit my hand in savage, animalistic fashion. Then all hell broke loose. I yelled in pain, clutching my hand that had just been bitten, looking for Exilius to mend my wound, but he was nowhere to be seen. Then my head started spinning, nausea crawling up my guts and intestines. With feverish reeling, dazed and half incapacitated, I realized that I've been poisoned. As I had that thought, I fell over and was only able to hazily watch the ensuing slaughter. The naked man rose above the ground and screamed, vanishing into the darkness, it taking his place. I didn't see much, and it causes a deep feeling of sickness to recall what it looked like. Suffice it to say that in my half-delirious state, I fancied I observed a massive abomination made from fused and sewn together humans, both alive and dead, partly rotting and withering. I just saw the men fighting valiantly, but ultimately in vain, being dismembered, eaten alive, or thrown into the dark abysses of the caverns by the creature. Soon my hearing would fail me, and I was thankful to not hear the agonizing wailings of my companions any longer. My vision clouded slowly, and the last thing I saw was a jetty black undead hovering lich, carrying the bodies away. Terrible vistas of emptiness rose on the horizon of my soul as everything went dark. Next thing I knew, I found myself on a carriage headed for Solitude, the soldiers on board telling me I had been found among pools of blood and entrails in a suspected necromancer's hideout. Now I am here. Believe what you will, but I know what I saw. It's easy to disregard this as a poison-induced fever dream, but I know what unfathomable madness I beheld down in that twisted, abyssal pit of nightmares and unholy corruption. As for the wanted necromancer, I don't know whence he strode, but if my suspicions are correct, I am coming to two conclusions. Firstly, that whoever he is incredibly powerful. And secondly, that his name appears to be Axilius Vinius. So, that was the Aquila Achilles report. Aquila's actually the name of the guy telling the story. It has been posted on October the 8th, 2019, but I know for a fact that this story is actually much older. I don't know how old, but I think I can check if I can find it. Let's see. It's actually from the 1st of September 2019, if I don't misremember. Yeah, so anyway, those were 3 stories, short stories. And they're all part of what is called the Necromancer Cycle. Now, the Necromancer Cycle is a collection of short stories with 2 long short stories that... You know what, let me just read the descriptions. So first some flavor text, and then comes the description of the Necromancer Cycle. So it says, "The darkness holds secrets blacker than night, and from the pits of unfathomable gulfs of emptiness emerges an adversary to all life, the apex predator who preys on the living. To his side rises his protégé, the necromancer. He shall bring about doom and decay, for he has been chosen by the one who has been banished eons ago. From his deeds the living shall tremble. By his hand the dead shall rise. By his book the ancient rituals shall be known. And the description reads, the necromancer cycle is an assortment of stories revolving around the titular necromancer who is on a mission to serve his deity. All of the stories tell the tale of various adventurers who happen upon either the dreaded necromancer himself or his henchmen. Every story presents a completed storyline on its own, while all stories within the cycle are connected to each other by hints and references rather subtly. As such, each tale can be read individually, and doesn't have to be viewed in any particular order. And we did none of that, so we didn't view it in any particular order. So the first part of the Necromancer cycle is actually Abada, which is the second story I've read today. It's part 0, if you will, and is more like backstory to everything. The Aqualake series report, Exodus report that I've just read is part 1. Part 2 is In the Depths of Madness, which we haven't read because it has 5 chapters and is actually quite long, with at least 25,000 to 36,000 words, if I'm not mistaken. Part 3 is actually Lost Ingredients Cast in Darkness Trapped in Flesh, which was our first story, and Part 4, which is the most recent one, is called The Blight from the Stars, which is one of my personal favorites, sporting 5 chapters, 1 prologue and 1 epilogue. Maybe, just maybe, if I ever have the time to read for 2 hours straight or so, I'll read one of the longer ones. Or maybe I'll do it chapter by chapter, who knows. So anyway, I think this is it. This concludes the short stories for today, for today's reading session. We've been here almost an hour, not quite. I have a couple of short stories left that I can read that aren't terribly long, with multiple chapters. Those are stories about, well, it's also horror themed, but they're about individual characters in the world that build on the idea of Skyrim character builds from the Skyforge forums. Interesting concept, to say the least. There is one that I've read last time, which is The Horror from Within the Mist, which was quite long, and I actually almost fell asleep reading it because it was so late. And then there's 3 more, which is Per Mortem Maleficarum, The Menace from the Woods, and The Stalker at the Fringe. And I think I'm going to read these next time, maybe. I don't know. But this shall conclude our stories for today. Oh, they actually say Sergio and not Sergio. Ah, that's interesting. Anyways, this shall conclude what I've been reading today. I hope you liked it. My Dunmill lady is appreciating your presence on the stream. But it's PlayStation 4 and without mods, so my Dunmill lady just doesn't look the way I used to craft them way back when I had the PC with mods. But it's the best I could do with the PS4 capabilities. It doesn't get any better than that. You know, I should probably do an Elden Ring stream and make some Elden Ring characters. I still have a few Elden Ring character concepts that I need to explore, which is Elder Scrolls races. I still need to make like an Altmer and an Orsimer and Jamora and such. But I've also done other races, like Danmer. I'm very proud of her. And yeah, I should definitely do that. So, anyways, thanks for listening to the stories. Thanks for being here. I always appreciate it. And Madame Milady, whose name I've forgotten, thanks you also. She shall have a drink, and I will get some rest. Maybe have a smoke. I don't know. So, I'm calling it a day. And I don't know how to end things. So, this was me reading stories. Goodbye. Also, I've just received a notification on the top right corner of my screen that there's comments being thrown, and I can't read them because I don't use the interface. And this might be terribly, terribly inadequate for any person who might want to stream, but I just don't do it. And actually, I've forgotten how to trigger the interface. I don't know anymore. There's a way, but I can't remember it, so I'm terribly sorry. I'm physically incapable of reading the comments because I don't know how to trigger the interface. Yes, I'm the best. I'm sure to receive a huge fan base one day with a guy who is too dumb to stream properly on his PS4, where there's like, I don't know, 8. There's like 16 buttons on the controller, that's it. Anyways, thanks so much for watching, thanks so much for listening, and right now I'm really calling it a day. So, good night, or good evening, or whatever, wherever you might be. I'll catch you next time.